Every gospel text has the story of the resurrection, but it's a little bit different. Last night we talked about the story from John's perspective, where Mary Magdalene actually met Jesus in the garden. However, we heard for this Sunday, we hear the gospel text from Mark. Now, Mark is a little bit different. Mark's story of the resurrection is a little bit bizarre. The Gospel of Mark ends really bizarre because there are two endings. Mark ends twice. And the lectionary reading that I read earlier actually is one of the endings. It goes right up to it where the women are too scared to say anything, and eventually they do tell Peter. Yes, they eventually go to, though it was not I. Just trying to remember how far this went. It actually says that they just fled and said nothing. Our lectionary has the first witnesses of the resurrection actually not saying anything to anyone. They're instead overcome by fear. The thing is that we have to go a little bit further into Mark to hear the story. I'm going to read a little bit more into Mark so that we can kind of get an idea of what happened after those women had seen this. Now, when he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. She went and told who had been with him, and they mourned and wept. But when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they would not believe it. After this, he appeared to another form to 2 of them, as they were walking into the country. And they went back and told the rest, but they did not believe them. Afterward, he appeared to the 11 themselves as they sat at a table, and he upbraided them for their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they had not believed those who saw him after he had risen. And he said to them, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel of the whole creation. He who believes and is baptized will be saved, but he who does not believe will be condemned. And these signs will accompany those who believe. In my name they'll cast out demons. They'll speak in new tongues. They'll pick up serpents. And if they drink anything deadly, it will not hurt them. And they'll lay their hands on the sick, and they will recover." At the heart of the Gospel of Mark, and I apologize to the people that go to my Bible study because they have to hear me rant about this all the time. At the heart of the Gospel of Mark is Jesus' mission. And Jesus' mission is central to the forgiveness of sins. That is what Jesus came to do in Mark. Makes it clear right at the beginning. Though Jesus is seen to do a lot of miracles, especially in Mark. Jesus casts out demons, heals people of their sicknesses in various different types, even from leprosy to the inability to use certain limbs. And there at one point is a person with a shriveled hand whose hand becomes unclutched and functions just like anybody else's hand. But at the heart of it, at the heart of what Jesus is doing is not about these miracles. It's instead this message: I forgive you of your sins. Now, everybody's fine with Jesus doing these miracles, casting out demons, healing the sick, being peaceful to other people. Everybody's fine with that. There's nothing wrong with that. The thing is, what people didn't like was what Jesus' message was to them. I forgive you your sins. To the people that received it, of course they liked it. They liked to hear that message, that you are forgiven of your sins. But then Jesus started saying it to another person, and another person, and yet another person, and yet another person. This is when it became a problem. We don't like to hear that forgiveness of sins going to other people. We're kind of a greedy people. We want to have that forgiveness all for ourselves, not because we're hoarding it, but because we don't like it when our enemies receive that forgiveness. We don't like to hear when people we don't like receive God's forgiveness. We want to hear the wrath of God coming down on them. We want to hear God pronouncing a judgment of hell and condemnation upon them. Thing is, that is why we killed Jesus. That was the whole message that we had throughout this past week. Jesus entering into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey, being praised king because of the message that he had proclaimed to the crowds. But then even the crowds turned on him as he said, "I forgive you," to the people they didn't like. And then, when all was said and done, Jesus was dead on a cross, which is where we are today. Where 3 days later, Jesus has been laying in the tomb. And some people have come to visit him, probably to prepare his body as part of the Jewish rites of death, to probably put spices and different things on him to preserve the body. But yet they came and saw something else. They saw an empty tomb. You have to think, that is pretty scary to see. Not because of some undead monster that's there, but rather this is the body of someone they loved. Someone that they loved dearly. It'd be very frightening to think of if we go to a funeral of a loved one and their body wasn't there. This was the case that these women saw, or this was the case that the women had. Their Lord was missing. And all they found in the tomb was a random young guy in a white robe, which I think is kind of funny for me saying that at this point. But all they saw was a young man sitting in the tomb who said to him, "Why are you here? Didn't you know what was going to happen?" I always like to think that this guy had a little bit of a snarky attitude, because Jesus had said all the time before this, "I'm going to die. I'm going to die. I'm going to die." The thing is, people didn't listen to the last part of that. They would always hear, "I'm going to die," or else they would ignore that. Most of the time they ignored that too, but they wouldn't even get to the second part of that, which is, "I'm going to die, but I will be raised up in 3 days." No one wanted to hear that last message because we have a lot of faith in violence. That's why Barabbas was chosen instead of Jesus at the trial. We believe that when judgment is passed by the people in this world, it has a long and permanent effect on everything. When we judge someone, their worthiness as a human being goes along with it. Because we don't like someone, therefore they are less than us. And we also like to think that God is in agreement with us, that God agrees with us that when we judge someone unworthy of God's forgiveness, that God's going to go along for the ride. That's not the case. That is definitely not the case. Otherwise, we would have no hope in this world. Jesus died specifically for the people who had killed him, which is everyone, but had died specifically to save all people and did not act out on the violence that was happening on him. Instead, Jesus rose from the dead. There was an empty tomb. The instrument of torture was empty. The cross is empty. The tomb is empty. Jesus rose from the dead. Jesus, instead of working out wrath against the people, or against the crowds, against the religious officials, against the Romans, instead acted in mercy. Jesus could have came down from that cross. Jesus could have smote anyone who was around him. Lightning bolts, whatever, you can use your imagination for that. But Jesus didn't. Instead, Jesus died and then rose from the dead to prove that even though we try our hardest to kill God, even though we try our hardest to take away God's responsibility, God ultimately wins. And God's winning, God's victory is not out of some act of strength, out of an act of power, but rather an act of complete and utter love. A love that has been given to you. A love that shows you that in this world, God's love is what will ultimately reign. The resurrection was an act of love that God had for this world. Not only is that resurrection what God did for Jesus, but it's also a promise to you that one day you will join Jesus in that resurrection. You will join Jesus in rising up from the dead. Not just rising up from the dead, but resurrection itself is more than that. Resurrection is the reflection of the glory of God shown through Jesus Christ. We will be raised up from the dead, changed, transformed in ways that we don't understand yet because it hasn't happened. But the promise is that sin would be removed and we will be wiped clean and joining together at the holy table. This promise is here for us now. God's kingdom has leaked through, and Jesus has joined us once and for all as we hear the proclaimed word and receive the sacrament. Jesus' promise remains with us, always for you, that God forgives you all your sins. And because of that, you have been given freedom from sin and death to live a life of love for one another.